It's hard to kind of define the moment that we're in, and that's kind of what we want to try and do today a little bit. Now, Cobus, I'm 54. I think you're about my age. We are products of an earlier era. We came of age in the Cold War. You came of age during apartheid. Very different, obviously, than the world that we live in today. But as an American, I was always raised with the idea that it was an American era, Pax Americana, and that the United States was central to the world order, that the United States was the governor, if you will, of that world order. In many ways, we Americans saw ourselves as a benign power, especially compared to the European powers that did formal colonies, even though the United States, of course, had some colonies around the world, Philippines being a good example of that. The sense in the United States was always that we were a benign superpower. We did not use the force that we had to occupy in the way that other empires had before. Now, you in Africa see this in very different terms, I think. You would see the Cold War as being much less than benign, particularly in Africa, but also in Southeast Asia where I live as well. But today, Cobus, that era is changing because the centrality of the United States and of Europe in the rules-based international order, in the world order, is changing because we have the rise of India, we have the rise of China, and as Fareed Zakaria says, it's the rise of the rest. And that has been a difficult notion, I think, for a lot of people in places like Washington, London, Brussels, and even to some extent, I would say even in places like Tokyo, to understand how the world has changed today. You've talked about on many occasions this idea that China presents an example to global South countries about how a country can modernize without westernizing. And that is such a powerful example for other countries and something that in many respects the United States finds very threatening. I'd love to get your take on that.
From my own perspective, I grew up outside of that sphere of the benign US superpower. And also I experienced in my life not only the passing from, I think I was a teenager when apartheid, depends on when you formally date the ending of apartheid, I was a teenager, around the time when all of these systems shifted. And I was in my very early 20s, I think, when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission started in South Africa. And that was a really big shift in which really one's entire worldview, for my generation specifically, one's entire worldview was essentially rearranged permanently. And so I feel like I kind of saw those things from both sides. And one of the things that I did see also from both sides in the process was the Cold War, because obviously the Cold War was hot in Africa, the apartheid army and the Angolans, for example, were, that it was a very long ongoing proxy war. But it was, and specifically it was part of the thinking of that time was realizing to which extent apartheid was a Western project, serving Western capital, embedded in Western systems, thinking of itself as Western. And so that really kind of complicated, I think, in a pivotal moment of my own life, it complicated my own relation to that. And that has kind of been ongoing because South Africa, has really kind of like rearranged itself mentally, I think, around some of these issues. And what is now kind of being seen, for example, in South Africa's ongoing kind of activism around Israel, at the moment, around the Gaza crisis specifically, I mean. And the reaction that activism that South Africa has done around Israel's, like raising the issue in the International Criminal Court, the reaction that raised in Western capitals has been very indicative, I think, of these issues, of these, like how live these conflicts are. So, I think South Africa famously sits on the cusp of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, right? Like the two oceans come together around Cape Town. And symbolically, South Africa has always been looking east and looking west at the same time. It's very, very hybrid in that respect. And at the moment, like South Africa is being pulled into the BRICS grouping, for example, and being such a strong partner for China is indicative of this larger shift in the world and the polarity of the world economy moving to Asia. A lot of the newest ideas coming out of the Indian Ocean rim and Asia, not from the Atlantic world anymore. And increasingly notions of modernity and notions of what the future is going to look like being fundamentally non-Western. While a lot of Western culture is backward looking, not necessarily partly in the Donald Trump sense, but also in obsession about legacy that one sees still also on the left side of Western culture. So with all of that, it becomes this kind of like a real kind of mixed up mess in some kind of ways, but also there's a space for new things emerging, which I think is also in its own way very exciting.
Well, it's exciting to you, but in many capitals in the West, in that Euro-Atlantic corridor, it's quite discombobulating, that they're not always sure of what their role in the world is if they're not atop the power pyramid. Well, there's a new book that's out, Westlessness, The Great Global Rebalancing, that tries to explain the trends in this moment that we're in. It's written by Samir Puri, who's also the author of two other books, The Great Imperial Hangover and Russia's Road to the War in Ukraine. Samir is a former British diplomat and also a former analyst at the U.S. defense think tank, the Rand Corporation. And we are thrilled to have Samir on the show.